Okay, I think we're set. And welcome everybody to what was going to be our last webinar of the year, but we actually have another one in December. But this is the final one that was part of this initial grouping of seminars that we were hoping for the year. And it's a repeat of the one that we were doing in May. We were just offline talking a little bit about how Cathy, we wanted to make sure as many people as possible got access to Cathy's material. So we're doing this one. We're recording this one so that people can access this, no pun intended, access this content here, there, in the future, and also hopefully hope to have a rich conversation today. My name is Joshua Lundy Whitler. I'm the interim president here at Alum, and we are excited once again to have Cathy Webb with us. We're going to talk a little bit today about accessibility as an issue that we often face when we're doing online education, how thinking through different issues about how people access the technology that allows our work to be done in many cases, how important that is, but also what kinds of things do we need to be keeping in mind so that this valuable resource that we have called the internet and through online education, how that can truly be accessible for all people. There are some issues that I think are hard to resolve, and I think Cathy will guide us through that, but help us to think through those things based on her own research and expertise. And before we start, I did want to add that really quickly that we'll have an annual meeting next week. The Alum's annual meeting is scheduled for next week. And then also, as I mentioned before, we do have one more webinar now. We'll have a webinar in December. And we do not have a registration link for it yet because it will be hosted by the Association of Theological Schools. We are having a webinar on to talk a little bit about research that is happening, kind of the burgeoning research that's happening around continuing education, and to talk about what creating sustainable lifelong learning programs at theological schools looks like. There is a number of grant programs that are being developed. ATS is behind a lot of this, of course, with help with the Lilly Foundation and the Pathways program that they've developed. But there's a lot of great stuff happening in that area, and so we're hoping to have some conversation around that. And again, ATS will be hosting that conversation. So that'll be Thursday, December 8th at 2 p.m. So that's very different. We usually have things on Tuesdays, and this is going to be a very different time slot. So it'll be a little bit off the beaten path there for us, but it'll be in early December. And so if you're interested in attending that, please put your email in the chat and let me know so that we can get you registered. Because again, our registration link that we had, we're actually going to change that link. And so just letting you know. But without further ado, I want to turn us over to the topic at hand here, which is accessibility in online education. And I didn't do a great job of introducing you, Cathy. I could give you the floor now and let you introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about who you are and what you hope to accomplish today.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I have some slides that I am going to share with you all. I'm not someone who uses Zoom half as much as someone who uses Google Meets. We're a Google Meet school, so you'll excuse me if I do a little bit of surfing around looking for things, but I'm also going to share the slides with you. So I just put a link into the chat. If you'd like to access them, you're welcome to download them. Look at them on there if that's more accessible to you, but they're exactly the same slides there that you can have access to. So I am just going to move on to our little agenda. There we go. So I'm going to start with an introduction, like it was just requested. Then we're going to spend some time looking at universal design for learning, particularly, and what that looks like in action. And then we'll talk about some best practices that you can use in your working with students. And then I want to spend a good amount of time at the end workshopping with all of you so that you can ask questions or try to figure out how things would work for you in the classes that you teach. Because obviously the classes that you teach are very different from the classes that I teach, or maybe the classes that somebody else teaches. So I want to give you an opportunity to have time to ask questions and maybe brainstorm together. So as we're talking, if things come up that you're like, I wonder how that would work for me, maybe make a little note about it so that when we come to the end and we're workshopping together, you have those ideas fresh at hand. I know for me, it's week 10 out of our semester. So my brain's running around with all sorts of different things going on. So it does not hold on to things very well if I don't write them down. So please feel free to write things down to help remind you what you were thinking about as we're going through our discussion. So just to give you a little bit about me, I am an assistant professor in communication sciences and disorders at Augustana College, which is in Rock Island, Illinois. I teach primarily in our speech language pathology preparation program for undergrads and graduate students. And then I am our local general education person in our department. So I also teach a lot of general education classes for undergrads. I got really lucky in that I started this job in August of 2020, having completed my dissertation in disability studies right during the end of, or the start of the pandemic. So when I started teaching, much of what I had to do was learn to teach hybrid and online. And it has been a blessing and a curse for access purposes. And so I want to help people think through what some of those things are, particularly that people could be doing to make online spaces more accessible, especially as that is a newer area in education. And I have to say, the worst class I took during my doctorate program was an online course. So I have some thoughts. So we'll talk a little bit about that later when we get into some of the best practices. So I want to just welcome you into this space as well. One of the things that is a good practice for making online spaces accessible is to allow anybody who wants to have their camera off if they need to. If you need to get up, sit on the floor, have a snack, do what you need to do to be able to pay attention and to listen. So don't worry about what it looks like on my end. Also, if you have a pet that joins you, that is completely okay. I know when I teach at home, my dog always comes on screen at some point without fail. So don't worry about that if you have a furry friend join you at some point as well. So part of the reason why this discussion is becoming more and more important, in addition to the pandemic, is that we have a really high number of people who have disabilities in the United States in particular. According to the best numbers we have, which are from 2019, the CDC estimates about 25% of the US has a disability of some kind, which is a really high number. And I think it's 19% of adults last I checked. But here's the kicker. All of these numbers are pre-COVID. So we don't even have any new numbers that represent the number of people who have experienced long COVID or side effects from COVID that have made working or living different from how it was before. So many of us in the disability community fully expect that the number of people with disabilities will significantly increase, that this is a mass disabling event. And so these kinds of educational accommodations and whatnot are going to become more and more common. In addition to that, we finally have laws in place that allow people with disabilities to participate fully in public educational spaces. The first law that allowed for students with disabilities to be in public elementary and high schools didn't come into effect until 1975. Which is not all that long ago. And so we are now seeing more and more disabled students enter higher education because they can, because they've actually had an education that allows them to participate and succeed in higher education. So because of that, accessibility has become an imperative. We really do need to make sure that we are considering all types of learners in our space. I'm sure you all have probably heard about diversity, equity, and inclusion until you're just ready to burst. And we as a part of the disability community, very firmly believe that disability is also a diversity issue. So it fits into that category of the imperative that we need to be thinking about as we think about learners that are coming up. So that's my brief spiel to get things kind of set and framed for you. But let's dig in a little bit into universal design. So universal design as a concept is actually from architecture, and there's 7 different principles that were developed to help make sure that people are able to access the built environment. But from that came universal design for learning, which is explicitly connected to education and how we can make educational spaces more accessible to people who are around us. So one of the things that has been kind of a hallmark of US American education for a long time is that we have built a system that everybody must fit into. And so I found this cartoon that's on the slide that I'm going to describe for you that I think is kind of evident of the system that we've built and why it doesn't necessarily work for everyone. So in this cartoon, there is a man sitting behind a desk with his hands pressed together. And he says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And he's looking at a big tree with no low branches, with a very thick trunk. And he is talking to an array of different animals. So there's a dog, a seal, a fish in a fishbowl, an elephant, a penguin, a monkey, and a bird. And I like this cartoon because I think it really illustrates how we've kind of said, this is the task I want you to do. And we've assumed that all people can accomplish it, when it's not necessarily possible for all people to complete the same task in the same way. The monkey and the bird have the most chances of success. But at the same time, you wouldn't say a bird climbed a tree, right? So did they actually complete this task? As well as the other animals on there, just not having a chance. No elephant's going to climb a tree, nor is a goldfish going to be successful in those tasks. And so we spent a lot of time building our educational system around how we feel like it should be based on what we've been taught and what we've seen before us. And we haven't really stopped in a lot of ways to accommodate the many different learners that exist out there today, as things have changed over time. So one of the things about universal design for learning is that it really requires intentionality on the part of the instructor. We have to sit down from the beginning, before we teach the class preferably, and think through what are the things that we can do to make these assignments work for more people. Oftentimes we talk about backwards design in education, which is the idea that you figure out what you want them to accomplish, and then you figure out how you want them to accomplish it. And I think that's something that's really important when we're thinking about universal design, because so often people are like, well, this is the way I've always done it. Okay, that's fine, but could we accomplish this task another way? Is there another way that you can get those same results or demonstrate that same learning that is different from what you've always done before? And thinking about that kind of creativity can really change the way that students interact in the classroom. So I want us to be thinking about the assignments that we have, the ways that we teach, and think, what is the ultimate learning outcome? What do I want students to walk away knowing? What do I actually care about versus what I've been told is the way I'm supposed to do this? Right? Are you allowing for different learning styles and expressions? Is it possible for you to change up the kinds of assignments that you have so that different types of people can participate in different ways? For example, I just assigned students to do this pros and cons paper, and several of them were like, oh, wow, can we do that in an infographic format to make it really creative? I was like, absolutely. If the content is there, you make it as pretty as you want, right? Like, I'm not necessarily grading on that piece, but they all felt, or not all of them, about half of them felt more comfortable creating this in an infographic or in some kind of like visually pleasant form versus writing another paper. So just thinking about ways that we can allow for students to express the same content in different ways. And then thinking intentionally about a multitude of ways that we can target the same thing. I oftentimes will sit down with an assignment and write out 3 or 4 different iterations of it and give it a go a different way each time I do it. And then sometimes I'll end up giving students a choice to say, hey, you can pick any one of these iterations to do the same assignment. I can use the same rubric generally, but they will pick a way that's more creative and works with the way that they think in order to do it. So looking at universal design, we can really start thinking from the base up about how we might be able to create our classes in a way that is accessible for more people from the start, so that we're not backtracking and having a whole bunch of different accommodations we have to meet later when we haven't planned for them. So we want to be thinking about many different aspects of our course when we think about universal design. I've been talking a lot about assignments, but also the way that we present information, even our syllabi. I don't know about you, but I have seen some syllabi that could be standalone books. And then I've seen some others that don't have any information on them at all. And so thinking about these kinds of things and how we set them up, it's about intentionality, just thinking about how we do these things. And so we might think about how they're allowed to be in the classroom space if you're in a physical space. So in my classrooms, I tell my students, if you need to get up and stand in the back, feel free to get up and stand in the back. Like if that's what's going to help you be able to pay attention, I'm okay with that. I'd rather have you standing in the back than falling asleep at your desk, right? And it's the same kind of thing online. You know, if you are going to fall asleep on your comfy couch or in your bed, you know, feel free to get up and move around and listen to the lecture in a more active way. How are we doing presentations and lectures? Participation is a really big one. A lot of people will count the number of times that someone says something or have really strict requirements for participation that require active listening and responding in the moment. But that is not how everyone's brain works. So even if everyone is required to say something every class, perhaps you consider allowing someone to email you their comment instead of saying it out loud if that's something that they're uncomfortable with. Or putting it in the chat is a big thing now with online education, having that opportunity. So we have to think about the different ways that we might go about doing these things in order to make things just go better. So what I want to do now is look at these different categories and kind of talk about some of the things that I've done or seen that have been really useful, particularly around online education, so that you can get an idea of what this might actually look like. And then we'll kind of jump into a summary before we workshop together. So for universal design, thinking about space, obviously with no physical space, it might feel a little weird, but thinking about things like, are there cameras on or off? This was a really big one at the start of the pandemic, especially for my friends who were high school teachers, because their students didn't really want to show what their home life was like, right, when everyone else was there. And maybe someone doesn't have a clean space, or they always have somebody who's wandering around in the back room, or they feel like they're going to be distracting if they need to get up and move around. So there's lots of reasons why someone might want to have their camera off. And so I think it's really important to either give people permission to make that choice, or if you are going to have a camera on rule, you can do something like actually explicitly teach them how to blur their background, or show them some of the other options that make it so that their space isn't as included in the online presence, because not everybody is comfortable with that. Another really good practice is having ground rules for your class. So oftentimes in the physical space, people might talk about food and drink and whether or not people have allergies and that. You don't have to worry about that online. But I have been in some lectures where people have said, like, you can't eat or drink while this class is going on. Well, why not? That doesn't make sense, like there's no real good learning reason why someone wouldn't be able to have a water bottle with them. And for some people with disabilities, they might need to regulate their blood sugar or otherwise eat in order to keep their body functioning in order for them to listen to you. So obviously you don't want somebody like with their microphone on eating Doritos, like that's not going to be helpful. But you can set classroom boundaries around how we go about doing this. Another thing is, gosh, I can't tell you how many online meetings I've been in where people just unmute and talk, and then they talk over each other, right? So you can't even follow who's talking or know whose turn it is. So setting expectations, like we're going to use the raise hand feature so that we can call on people in an orderly fashion. That can really reduce anxiety in a lot of people as well, who are like, oh, I don't want to speak over somebody, so I can't participate in this. Like there's a lot of mental turmoil that might go on in some people around participation generally. And then when participation is chaotic, that makes it a lot harder. So setting those kind of class rules, what are your expectations for the group? This is what I allow or don't allow. This is how I plan our class to go. It's okay if you get up and go to the bathroom and come back, just, make sure you're muted and don't have your camera on in the bathroom. Whatever those pieces are that you want to clarify, oftentimes laying out those rules ahead of time can be really good for the group. Even if you think that people should assume this, one of the things that I have found very frequently, especially with people who don't spend a lot of time in a classroom, is that they don't know what the rules are these days, especially with online meetings. So making sure that you have those in place can be really helpful. Fidgeting is also a thing. I encourage people to fidget if that helps them. So they might draw, they might have a toy. So I have this lovely chainmail ball that I'll mess around with. You can't tell that I'm doing it, but I can do it and make sure that I am able to move my body enough to be able to pay attention without distracting other people. So I'll explicitly say, if you need to fidget, feel free, do what you need to do to be in that space, to be present. And then also thinking about breaks. Do you want to allow students to just turn off their camera and go to the bathroom when they want to? Or are you somebody who says, we're going to lecture for an hour and then take a 5-minute break where everyone can go take care of themselves, and then we're going to come back and lecture again? So just setting up those ground rules for that space can be really helpful for learners, especially people who are neurodiverse, people on the autism spectrum, or who have obsessive compulsive disorder or anxiety disorders. Having that ground rule and knowing what to expect can be really comforting and allow people to listen and participate a lot more than if it's all unknown and they're, it's different from instructor to instructor. I don't know what this person wants, but I know what this person wants. And it can just build in people if they're feeling a lot of uncertainty. And it doesn't take much at all to establish some of these rules on the first class and then remind people as you go. You can even put them in your syllabus or in your learning management system as well. There's lots of different ways to go about it. And I know this is not best practices and that I'm talking to you a ton, but I am going to only present a few more slides and then we're going to spend the rest of our time talking together. So I figured for recording purposes, it makes more sense to have a chunk of lecture and then kind of go on to talking together. All right, so if you are somebody who uses presentations and lectures, and I know I very often use some kind of visual to help people follow along, things that can be really helpful are making your slides available ahead of time. I presented you all with an opportunity to have access to these slides ahead of time. I know many of my students like to take notes on their slides, but I also have several students who need to know what the content is that's coming in order to pay attention well as we're going through the information. And so being able to skim through those slides and know what's coming can be really, really helpful. Now I've given them to you in a Google Docs form, or Google Slides, I guess. So you could download those and take notes right into them. But many people will also share them as a PDF so that they're not editable or shareable in the same way as what I shared with you. So you can do what you're comfortable with in sharing those documents, but it's highly recommended that you provide that information ahead of time to students. You also want to think about what font style you're using, how big the font is, whether or not you're using a color that will contrast and stand out. So obviously this presentation has a dark background and light letters, and that is one way to get good visual contrast. A lot of my presentations have white backgrounds and black texts. And while that's kind of boring, it's incredibly accessible. So you want to be thinking about what you're doing with size and color. Anytime you put a yellow text on a slide, you know no one's going to see it, right? So thinking about those kinds of things to ensure that people can actually see what's going on. For people who are blind or low vision, providing image descriptions and alt text are really helpful. So image description is describing the pictures that are on your screen, like what I did for you with that comic on the last page. Whereas alt text is actually going into the system and embedding into the picture text about what the picture looks like, so that if somebody is using a screen reader to look at their notes, when they get to that picture, the screen reader will read the description for them. So this provides access to everything on the slide just as much as it is for anybody who's sighted. If you are a Zoom person, you want to make sure your auto captions are on. You as the host have the ability to decide whether or not people can access the captions. If you haven't turned that on, your students can't use it. Whereas in Google Meets, it's always on. They just have to select it to turn it on. When you turn on auto captions, it does not automatically show up for every individual. They still have to, thanks for turning that on. They still have to click the button that says, I want to see the captions. But this is really helpful for people who have a hearing loss, but also for people for whom English is not their first language. It can be really helpful to see the words. Or I just was in a meeting earlier today where they had terrible microphone quality. And I could turn the captions on and catch a lot more of what that person was saying than if I wasn't able to see the words. So just having that turned on at the start of your meeting is a really easy way to make things more accessible. And it doesn't cause much effort on your part at all. Another thing would be when you show videos, make sure they are ones that have captions, preferably real captions and not auto captions. Auto captions are helpful, but I don't know about you, but I've seen some real bad auto caption fails that you're just like, ooh, that's not what I said. It can be quite funny. So if you're going to be showing a video that has captions that are auto captions, you might well want to preview it in case some of those things auto caption in an inappropriate way. So just put that out there. And then you want to be considering your multiple learning styles. Besides just lecturing, how else are you engaging students? What kind of activities are you having them participate in? Are you always having them do group projects? Or do you vary it up, right? So that maybe they're working with a group of 3 one time and on their own the next time. Just thinking about those different pieces can be really helpful for people. So we talked a little bit about participation before, and just making sure that you've explicitly said multiple forms of participation are acceptable in this course. I consider it participation if you type a comment into the chat. Sometimes people are worried that those don't count, or that you're not looking at those, or that they don't contribute to the conversation. One of the things that I do for people who put things into the chat is I will then read out what's in the chat for access purposes for everybody else in the class. Maybe they're on the phone, or they're driving, or they can't see it themselves. So I'll say, oh, Tay put a comment into the chat and I'm going to read that for you right now, right? So we can facilitate that part of the conversation and keep that going. Obviously having things like raising their hands, but I also use something where I actually have the weekly participation for one of my undergrad classes is that they have to submit a reflection. And for me, they submit 3 things. So they have to say something they learned, something they are confused about or want to learn more about, because not everyone is confused every time. And then I ask them to tell me how they're doing. And it's interesting because I give them examples. I say, oh, you can say, I'm great, or meh, or tell me about your life. And 9 times out of 10, they tell me about their lives. I know all about things that they have gone to and done, but I also know when they're incredibly stressed out. And when I need to be more generous with time or with the activities that we're doing in class. So doing something like that for participation can work just as well as having people speak up during your time together. So that's one of the things I do for participation points. Another thing that's really super helpful is providing thinking time. A lot of people, especially those who are neurodivergent, don't do well with surprise and don't do well when put on the spot, but otherwise have wonderful things to contribute. So you can give a question and then ask people to take a minute to think to themselves. Let people collect their thoughts and then ask, hey, who wants to contribute about this particular topic? I find that that works really well for some of the students who need more processing time. And not only that, but it helps with the students who are just natural hand raisers. You know, there's always somebody in the group who's like the first one with their hand that shoots up. And then you're like, well, I called on you 4 times already. I'd like to call on somebody else. But you're the first, like, is that my ethic? So if I give them time to think about it, oftentimes when I ask who has questions, some of those people who aren't quick on the jump will raise their hands at the same time. And I can call on a bigger variety of people to contribute to the conversation. Another option is to provide the questions in advance. If you know that you're going to be talking about this topic and these are the questions that you generally end up asking about it, you can just post a document in your learning management system with the questions for that day. And any student who actually wants to know them ahead of time to prepare will look at them. And those who don't, won't. Doesn't hurt anybody to have extra resources on hand, at least in my experience. So the final area I want to talk about is exams. We sometimes get really stuck on exams and that this is the thing that we need to do in order to test people's understanding. But in addition to like structural and oppressive issues why exams might not be the best, exams are really good if you're looking to see if someone memorized something. I don't think that in the majority of your courses, you actually care if they have something memorized, right? What are you actually looking for? In a lot of my courses, I'm like, I don't care if they know that that law was passed in 1973. I care that they know what that law is about and what that law does, not when it was passed. Although that I think is interesting personally. So you want to think like, what's the point of this exam? Am I asking them to memorize or retain material? Am I asking them to prove that they did the reading? Is that the whole point of my exams? Or am I getting at something different? And could that be evaluated in a way that's not a sit down and fill in the bubbles kind of exam? So some of the things that we might consider when we're looking at an exam is timing. A lot of people will say like, oh, you have an hour once you start that exam and now you have to complete it in that time. But that doesn't work for everybody. Not everybody is speedy at answering questions. They might need more time. Are they allowed to use their resources? Several of my classes, I say, if you don't know the answer, go look it up. I care more that you get this right because you saw the information and you know it than that you had this memorized. So is that something that is important for your class or not? So just thinking about like, what is my ultimate goal for this exam? Why do I want them to know this information? And that can be really helpful in kind of sussing out whether or not this should be an exam. And if it should, what kind of exam should it be? All right, so this is my summary slide here. So just make sure that you are, when you're thinking about best practices, consider the ultimate outcome. It's not about what you've always done, what's tradition. It's about what you want students to get out of this now. And with the way the world has changed and the advent of online technology and other things, how are we doing this different in a way that allows more students to participate than before? We also want to be thinking about designing with all people in mind from the front, so that we don't have to do as much accommodating later. One of the things I frequently hear from people is they get accommodation letters from students and they have to make all of these changes. But if you make these changes up front, you never have to make those accommodations when somebody asks for them because they're already there, which can be really helpful. I like to ask students if I'm actually meeting their needs. Are they bored to death? Is there something I could do differently that would help them actually be able to learn, and then being open, obviously, to that feedback when you hear it. And you might have to discuss what is actually changeable versus what is not actually changeable. And then being explicit about why we're doing something the way that we're doing it. I have to oftentimes explicitly tell my students, like, I'm leaving this exam open for you for a long period of time, so you can go look it up. Because I don't care if you've memorized this information, I care that you've learned this information. And then I explicitly include policies in my syllabi. So I have some inclusive syllabi language. There's a link there that you can look at. And then just making sure that you know that you tell your students that you are trying your very best to make your course accessible to all people. And what is it that you can do to help them be able to learn better? Because most of the time they have really good ideas, but they don't feel like they can share that unless they're given permission to do so. So putting that out there explicitly is really helpful. All right, so excuse me. I'd like to take some time for us to talk together, and I'm gonna close down the slides in just a second. But we can think about what changes might you make? Where are you stuck in thinking about how you might make your course more accessible? Do you have any questions? And we'll kind of talk through those together for the rest of the time that we have. But I also have a slide here of a whole bunch of resources. Some of them are free online resources that you can link to from this reference list. And others are names of books that might be really helpful for you if you're thinking about what else to do for your courses that would be more accessible. So I'm going to stop sharing and stop prattling on. So this is the point where I would love for you to let me know what kinds of things are you thinking of that you might be able to change or grow? What questions do you have? And just like in my presentation, you are welcome to use your voice or put your comment into the chat box. However you participate best is just fine by me. So what questions do you have? Yeah, Tay?
Okay, so I'm going to kind of dive in the deep end here for you a little bit. So one of the things that we're trying to work toward is WCAG compliance 2.1 AA kind of level. But, you know, a lot of the organizations and teachers that we work with have no idea where to even start with that, right? And they find like those kinds, when I rattle off something like that, they're like, what? You know, and I'm like, okay, you know, so then I give them access to things like, you know, I use a Moodle-based site. So we've got like Brickfield, you know, accessibility toolkit that we can run and generate a report, things like that. But I'm finding there's a lot of sort of, first of all, just people feeling really intimidated by even where to begin. And then, you know, and I say, oh, but just Google it. I mean, there's lots of stuff, you know, online, but it feels to a lot of people like an extra kind of burden to put their courses through that kind of a checker, or to sort of start to even think about things like checking contrast ratios, checking the subtitling. That, you know, even when I get into things with people, I'm like, you know, they'll want to like put a PDF in their course, and I'll be like, did you run the accessibility tool on Adobe? And they'll say, well, I don't have an Adobe subscription, right? I generated the PDF using, you know, Word, you know, that kind of thing. Like, so, I mean, do you have some helpful strategies to kind of get people past that initial kind of resistance to even sort of beginning to go toward compliance?
Yeah, that is definitely one of the big problems. And I think that's part of why I keep pushing on you don't have to do it how you always have because so many people are like, well, this is how I do this. And I don't know if I feel comfortable learning it a new way. So some of the things that I point to very frequently are that the world in general is becoming more accessible. If you think about Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, like they all have options now for alt text, for including captions automatically on things. Like we're getting to a place where our students are going to really expect this. And we need to get on board or that's going to be a problem. So sometimes I'll use that as a framing, and which helps for some people who are like, oh, well, it wasn't going to matter for me anyways. I'm like, well, maybe it will if students are expecting this and you're not doing it. For people who don't want to run their things through the software, I sometimes will start with the fact that you don't necessarily have to run it through every time once you figure out what's accessible. Right? Like when you know the things that work, you can stick with those things and you don't have to run every presentation through it, right? If you know that this particular, you're going to use PowerPoint, and anytime you put an image in, you know how to add the alt text. Like if you can do that, you don't have to run it every single time because people, that's what I think people think is that, oh, it's burdensome. I'm going to have to do this so much. But really it's like, you got to learn it. And then you can use it regularly. Another thing I've done with people who are less familiar with screen readers, because most of us are less familiar with screen readers, if we're honest, is we have built in software, many of us in our phones, that are screen readers. And so I can ask Siri to read my document to me. And if Siri can't do it, it's not accessible. So I think sometimes asking those normal tech things to do these jobs will like helps people get into it a little bit more because you can, you know, have Siri read you the document on your way home from work. And you can like make it a part of your practice that way. It really is hard to get people who are seriously not on board to do things, but sometimes giving some of these shortcuts can be a really good way. Or I've had several students who are blind or low vision where I think I have things that are accessible. I think I've done it well. And I explicitly give them permission to tell me if I haven't. And I will fix it for you, right? So sometimes having that caveat in there as well, because if your students are holding you accountable toward it, you're more likely to actually make that happen. That can also be really helpful for people who are not sure quite where to go yet. I know that's not a like quick and easy answer to your question, but I think some of those more built-in things can be really helpful.
That's helpful, thanks. I mean, I think it is a bit of a cultural change for a lot of our institutions, you know.
Yeah, huge. Yeah, I mean, even my own institution we use Moodle, and I hate Moodle. It's so inaccessible for so many reasons. It's just a bad system. But you get what you pay for, right? So, you know, even trying to have those conversations about changing over to something that jives with the younger generation can be really hard for people who are used to doing it the way they're doing it.
Yeah. Canvas is not perfect, but it has it just developed Studio. It's the Studio seems to work really well with creating transcripts that are pretty accurate. I found there's actually an approval process, and I find that the transcripts that come out of the captions that come out of the Studio for Canvas are really good. They're much higher quality than what you get from standard auto-generated text. So I don't have a fully formed question, but I wanted to comment on or at least raise the topic of participation, because you were talking a little bit about how important it is to create different modes of participation. And I think, you know, as a teacher, I've tried to do that in a variety of ways, you know, creating text options as well as, and we've even done like, you know, video submissions and PowerPoint submissions for different things. But I do have, you know, there are times when essays are required, you know, and you do have that kind of it's hard to kind of break through. I just sense a tension in myself, and I wanted to raise it all also about this idea of trying to make things as even as possible and fair as possible for everybody. You tend to think of, well, we got to do the same thing for everybody in order for that to be fair, right? So there's a little bit of a tension there, just in terms of like, if you're giving some people the option of an essay and then giving other people like, well, you can do a PowerPoint presentation. There might be some blowback there, especially if you're working with I mean, in the context of continuing ed and working with adult learners, this is not as much of an issue, but there might be some cases where this comes to like be thinking about what this looks like, and there might be some specifics here that we could look at with adult learners. But what do you? I guess I'm just raising this up as a point of if you have any comments to make, any further comments to make about this participation piece. I don't have a real question, but it's just something I'm thinking about and kind of pondering.
Yeah, so generally I will offer the same thing to the entire class. And what ends up happening is there are people who would rather die than give a presentation. And there are people who would rather write an essay than give, or do a presentation than write an essay, right? So if I'm setting this up and I'm saying, okay, class, we're doing this assignment. This is the content I need in it. You can do it one of these two ways. Then I'm giving everybody the flexibility to do it. And I'm not individually singling out people and saying, oh, well, because of your disability, you can do it this way. It's more of I've set it up for this whole class that you don't have to come stand in front of everybody if that terrifies you, because there are plenty of us who don't like that. So basically like setting up things like that, where you still have the same content, you still have the same expectations for quality, but they're doing it in different formats and letting people choose. Now, in that case, I also like have them sign up, so I know how many presentations I need time for. But oftentimes giving people all of those options and saying, these are equivalent to me, is the best way to go about that. Whereas there might be occasionally somebody who like really doesn't do the thing well, and you want to give them a second chance. So you might have them do it a little differently. Like that's a little bit of a different situation. But I think most of the time I offer it to everybody. So I don't offer them anything I don't want to grade. But oftentimes it's nicer for me to grade half presentations and half papers instead of 20 papers, right?
Yeah, I love that. The idea, that's making everything creating a variety of options for people, and they kind of select. And that can get a little bit, I think sometimes people hear that and think, oh, you need all these different grading standards or whatever. But, I think it's doable. I think it's definitely doable. And
I'll often use the same rubric for both projects even.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'll put on the rubric is included all of the requirements from the requirement sheet. So the requirement sheet for the PowerPoint is going to be different than the requirement sheet for the essay, right? So I kind of get at it that way, because otherwise I want the same content and information. So I can even do it on one rubric, which makes life a lot easier. Anything else that people are thinking about, wanting to brainstorm or ask a deeper question about? Feel free to unmute yourself or drop it into the chat.
I'm trying to think a little bit about what the specific, like how this relates to lifelong learning for ministry, and how, like, when we're working with individuals who are either working towards ordination or have been ordained for a long periods of time, that are coming from very specific, I mean, they're certainly coming from certain expectations of what education is, certainly expectations of what communication should look like. I'm just thinking, I'd love to hear anybody's thoughts else in the room of how issues of accessibility might come up in this context. You all are doing this work.
Well, I mean, I'd say that a lot of the people that I work with is sort of SMEs. They are, from the church world. If they're not sort of been in academia for a while, they really don't know anything about accessibility or like what the standards are. Or like I got a message from somebody just like yesterday. It's like, how does subtitles work? I'm like, oh man, where do I start? It's like how to set up, they didn't even know about like auto captioning, right? Or anything like that. And I'm like, wow, we really got to start, from the beginning. Okay. So that's one of the big challenges that I find I'm dealing with is just SMEs that have no idea about anything accessibility wise or universal design wise.
Yeah. I love the idea of like setting up a resource that people could reference to answer some of those questions simply. I obviously don't spend as much time in the adult education realm as you all do. But I find that most of us who are adults are more self-interested in learning, and will look at those things if there's something that are important to us. And so having even a document that says like, here's how you turn on auto caption, and here's how you find this, and this is what alt text is and how you put it in, and just like creating an accessibility document, like the idea of that really excites me. Obviously, I don't have something like that at this moment, although I do have instructions for captioning on YouTube if anybody needs those. I pass those around my university regularly. But I think that's a really great idea to like help some of those people who haven't been in it long or don't know, because the church is historically notably inaccessible, and is legally allowed to be so. So it doesn't help people in including those accommodations in daily life, let alone in education.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the bigger issues as educators is to model what accessibility looks like in a world where online ministry and online community is becoming more and more the norm, if not the norm, then a norm. And so how to model that kind of learning, because there's a learning curve like Tay was already talking about, but how do you model that kind of community building that's truly inclusive, right? And other people. How do you actually open those doors, and not make sure that you're shutting doors that you don't need to necessarily shut?
Well, and especially with that, we have so many disabled people right now who during the pandemic were able to go to church for the first time.
That's right.
Because they could go safely. I also know people who with immune compromised statuses who were like, I could never go be with that many people. And now I can be with them regularly because things are online. Like the way that things have shifted have worked superbly for the disability community. But if you go to an online meeting and it's highly inaccessible to you, you still won't go back, right? So we have an opportunity here that hasn't existed before to reach a lot of people who literally could not get into the building, and parents of kids who just could not make their kids get ready and go and sit for however much time you need to sit. So I think there's so much excitement here in what could be, but if we're not raising people who are aware of it, then they're not going to make those changes that they could make.
Okay, I think I have a real question this time. Now, so that raises the question of like hybrid. So in learning, there's hybrid classrooms. In ministry, hybrid has become very, very normal. Zoom running in the middle of a live service. It's often done terribly. It's just awful. And I, early in the pandemic, was an advocate because of let's not do hybrid at all. Let's either go asynchronous and do everything this, and this was both for teaching and ministry because I'm working kind of in both worlds. Do everything asynchronous or just do it live. None of this in between, because hybrid becomes so complicated and you end up speaking towards two different, and then you end up not being as accessible because my partner, my spouse, is in a coaching learning program right now, and she's the only one who's distance and everybody else is in person. And her learning experience has just been really bad. She feels left out of half the conversations. And I just like, what if she had an accessibility issue? It would be even harder. So so that I guess is like, because at the same time, now that I've kind of come around and seeing this active in churches, I've seen some instances where hybrid has been done better than others. And I've kind of stepped a little bit back from the hybrid is terrible and never should be done to maybe there's a time and a place for it. So, but what would you say to those who are thinking about accessibility in terms of hybrid settings, both for the educational settings and also as they're helping ministers or people who are doing their own hybrid settings, how to help them kind of think through accessibility in those contexts?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, hybrid is hard. It's hard to manipulate two different platforms at the same time and reach everybody equally. So there are definitely going to be challenges with doing that. The majority of the times that I have seen hybrid done well, there has been a person appointed to be the facilitator between the online and the in-person. Generally, they're an in-person person. Yeah, some of those words in some of that order, who have a laptop in front of them where they have it on mute, and they're able to see the chat and see when people raise their hands, and they're able to facilitate between those who are physically present and those who are in an online presence. And that has been the most successful thing that I have seen, because they can say, hey, Joe on the computer has a question, and then they can get called on and they can express their question from online, or read it out if it's typed, whatever it is. And then the person can answer back directly to them. So specifically for education, having a facilitator works really well. I know most people don't happen to have an extra human to do that for them, like a graduate assistant or somebody who can. So I've actually seen it done where every class period, a different person in the class volunteers to do that. And that they get like a participation point or something when it's their turn, and they act as the facilitator that day. So you can still use the people that you have in the room to make this work. And it's not too cumbersome of a system to get that to happen. So I think if churches could imagine more what it would look like to allow for online participation, to maybe intentionally have an online Bible study, and then, in-person Bible studies, or like to think about how they can set up their world in such a way that they accommodate all these different people. Because we are in such a place where, like, please don't come to work if you're sick. I think that's like just a good ethic for all humans to not come to work when they're sick. But it's more of the thing that we're pointing to now. And so if we're able to say, hey, we recognize that the world is kind of in a weird spot. We want to be inclusive to all people, and therefore we're offering multiple options so that it can fit all sorts of different people. But it also like benefits the single mom who can't ever get to anything because she has no one to watch her kids, to be able to participate in a hybrid or online class as well. So I think if we start pointing to the fact that this works for and helps so many different kinds of people, and not just disabled people, although we are important also. I think, it's always we don't have anybody like that here. But I bet if you took a poll, you probably do. And the way that people have gotten used to the world working now, people are expecting things to be online and virtual as well as in person. And so I think there's nothing wrong with offering multiple options, and we need to make that more normal, because people really think, oh, we have to go back to normal. But normal didn't work for everyone. So why are we going back to what didn't work? And I think making that kind of the emphasis can be really helpful in helping people to think about how to do these more hybrid or virtual and in-person options better. Because if you're investing in this long term, instead of this being the COVID Band-Aid, you want to get better at it and do it better. And I think framing it that way should help people who want to invest in it actually invest in it, instead of just assuming this is a short-term thing we don't have to get good at. Sorry, that's a bit of a soapbox for me.
So I have a question. So in January, I hold a conference for pastors mostly and alumni called the School for Leadership Training. And anyway, so during COVID, I moved to all online with that. And then last year I did a hybrid, because all of a sudden there was like an outbreak of COVID. And so there was lots of people that didn't want to come. And so I did a hybrid thing. It was like a nightmare for me to get the workshops to be for both the people in person and the people online, because some of my workshop people, the workshop people were all going to have to be in person, but people could join online if they were not. But then some of my presenters could not be in person. And so it became a logistical nightmare. So anyway, this year I decided that, well, maybe we wouldn't do workshops online, but now I'm feeling really like, oh, I need to, because my conference is creating communities of belonging, appreciating everybody. And it's about how you do in diversity, inclusion, and all that kind of thing. But I'm wondering if I don't know that I can do all my workshops, because that's what happened last year, is that suddenly that, like, when the third group would go on, it would kick somebody else off. Well, then I found out that the Zoom had changed, because the year before I had created 6 Zoom rooms and they all worked and it was good, but it was all online. And anyway, and so it was like, I can only create 2 Zoom rooms now. And so it's interesting. So I wonder, can I have some of my workshops be accessible from online, but not all of them? Or is that not a good thing?
So tricky. I am involved in conference planning for the Institute on Theology and Disability, and we did our first hybrid conference this last year, and intend to continue doing that going forward. And it definitely is not easy logistically. So props to you for doing that, especially on your own. It's not simple by any means. Obviously, it would be preferable to be able to offer everything virtually, but it is a kind of sticky wicket, I guess, if you're stuck with the number of Zoom meetings that you can have or that kind of thing. So something you could consider is it possible to record those sessions that aren't going to be live, that you could post those later for attendees who are attending virtually?
Well, and maybe that's some of my issue too, is that last year I recorded all of my sessions and posted them for all the things. And so it was like, then people that would have only had access to 4 workshops suddenly had access to like 20 workshops. And so that became a logistical nightmare too. And, you know, I really believe in the facilitator, that you need somebody to help facilitate that with that. And unfortunately, you know, I got to train people to be able to do that, because somehow people, I don't know, it doesn't come easy for people, but yeah, no, I think that's really important to have that, especially if the presenters aren't used to doing that hybrid format kind of thing. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we in the conference this summer, we actually asked presenters to identify if they were confident leading this in a hybrid format themselves, or if they wanted a facilitator in their room, so that we could allow people like myself who had been doing it, who were used to it, to be able to just, you know, go through the motions the same way, but give somebody who, especially to those who have very little technical know-how, who struggle with the PowerPoint, to have somebody there for them who can facilitate that is especially helpful. But it is super duper tricky, and trying to figure out like what is equitable when you're looking at who has access to what, and how many people, and are you having to choose for people what they have access to? That can be really sticky. Another thing that you could do is offer for people to be able to present from online. And then you could have a room of people who are in the watch party, essentially. So people who want to watch in person could join from the conference in a room. And the presenter would be on the screen, and then someone in there could facilitate still between the online and in person. I especially don't support not allowing virtual presentations, because so many disabled people can't get in person. I'm somebody who's vulnerable to extreme illness or death from COVID, so I'm not coming, but I would love to be there, right? So having that opportunity to participate or present virtually has made it so much easier for me to be able to participate in things And that's true for many disabled people. So a little trickier for sure, but definitely something to think about. And I'm sure something that would really benefit you to have a team who can help you with. So I'm sorry if you are having to do all of that on your own, Viva, because that's a lot. Does anybody else have anything they want to add to the conversation? Or ask, I guess. I used to work in deaf education, so I'm really good with long silences. So if you all are feeling it, I apologize. It doesn't really bother me. All right, well, sounds like we don't have any other questions. So Joshua?
Yeah, and I'm really regretting that we didn't record at least part of that conversation that we had back in May, because I feel like if we could put those two conversations together, that would be really beautiful. But I think we covered a lot of it today, and so much resource, so many resources there in the slides that we have access to here. Those of us that are here in the room. If you're watching this on YouTube in the future, you can contact us and we'll send you the slides. Assuming that's okay with you, Cathy.
Yes, please.
And that's wonderful. I want to thank. I like doing twinkle hands as my applause. This is my online accessible applause here for Cathy, and big thanks to you, and also for coming twice now this year, and gracing us with your presence, and helping us learn through these very important issues, talking through some very practical matters, but also, these end up being pointing to some broader issues about, what our philosophies of accessibility are, and kind of how we approach the future, and how we approach thinking about what our role is as educators. And those, there's a lot of issues here that we could dig in and explore if we had the time. So thank you for opening up this conversation, and hopefully now people know your name. If people want to get in contact with you, I'm sure, send lots of email her. She loves that.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and please do reach out if you have questions, or if something comes up that you just aren't sure what to go about. I'm happy to chime in and provide any kind of support that I can, even if it's just empathetic ear.